I was caught by the law, found my true self. The night officer, Daniel Reyes, snapped the handcuffs around Marcus Webb's wrists. It was raining so hard that neither man could see the other's face clearly. And maybe that was the mercy of it, because Marcus was crying. And he hadn't cried in 11 years. He was 31 years old, soaked to the skin, standing in the yellow glow of a parking lot light outside a convenience store in a city that had never once felt like home. The bag he'd dropped to the ground held 2 stolen bottles of cough syrup and a granola bar he hadn't even eaten yet. A granola bar. That was the thing that undid him, not the handcuffs, not the flashing blue and red lights painting the wet asphalt, not the voice on the police radio, crackling something about a male suspect in custody. It was the granola bar, still in its wrapper, lying in a puddle, and Marcus thinking that he couldn't even steal right anymore. He couldn't do anything right anymore. He hadn't been able to for a very long time. The drive to the station was silent except for the rain and the wipers. Marcus sat in the back seat with his wrists aching and his head bowed, watching the blurred city lights smear across the window like a painting someone had ruined. He thought about his mother, which he almost never allowed himself to do. He thought about the version of himself that had existed before everything went wrong. The boy who used to read encyclopedias for fun, who'd won a science fair at age 12, who had dreamed, with the specific and burning certainty only children possess, of becoming someone important. He thought about how far he had traveled from that boy, and whether the distance was even measurable anymore. Marcus had grown up in the kind of neighborhood where ambition was treated like a liability. His father left before he had memories of him. His mother worked double shifts at a laundry facility and came home with hands so raw they looked like something that needed bandaging. She did everything she could, and it was genuinely a lot. But the world around Marcus was louder than she was, and the world taught him early that softness was weakness, that dreaming was embarrassing, and that the only currency worth having was toughness. By 16, he had learned to keep his encyclopedias hidden. By 19, he had stopped reading altogether. By 23, after 2 years bouncing between low-wage jobs and couch surfing, and a relationship that burned itself to nothing, he had fallen into a cycle of substance use that hollowed him out slowly, the way water hollows stone. Not dramatically, not all at once, but persistently, invisibly, until one day you look and there is nothing left where something solid used to be. The years between 23 and 31 were not a story. Marcus could tell in a straight line. They were fragments. A shelter in Cincinnati where a man named Terrence once shared his last cigarette and his last dollar and asked nothing in return. A job at a warehouse in Columbus that lasted 4 months before Marcus walked off the floor one afternoon and simply didn't go back, unable to explain even to himself why his legs had carried him out the door. A night in a church basement where he sat in a folding chair and listened to other people describe their lives and heard, for the first time, the exact shape of his own pain described in someone else's words. A phone call with his mother at Christmas where neither of them said what they actually meant. An eviction notice taped to a door. A winter that lasted longer than winters are supposed to last, and then a parking lot and handcuffs, and a granola bar in a puddle, and the terrible clarity of a man who has finally run completely out of road. At the station, they put Marcus in a holding room that smelled of industrial cleaner and old coffee. He sat with his elbows on a metal table and his face in his hands for a long time. A public defender came and went. Papers were signed. There was talk of a diversion program, relatively new initiative the county had launched, offering first-time nonviolent offenders a path toward rehabilitation instead of incarceration, provided they agreed to participate fully and consistently. Marcus barely listened. He nodded where nodding seemed expected. He felt the way a building feels after the last tenant has moved out, structurally present but fundamentally empty. But then something happened that Marcus would spend years afterward trying to fully explain, because it didn't seem like the kind of thing that should matter, and yet it changed everything. Officer Reyes, who had brought him in, came back into the holding room just before the shift ended. He wasn't required to. He had no paperwork left to complete, no official reason to be there. He sat down across from Marcus, set a cup of vending machine coffee on the table, and said nothing for a moment. Then he said in a voice that was quiet and entirely without judgment that he had a brother who had been where Marcus was sitting, almost exactly about 12 years ago, and that his brother now ran a youth mentorship program in the same neighborhood where they'd both grown up, and that he wasn't saying this to give a speech or make a point, but just because he thought Marcus looked like someone who had forgotten that the story wasn't over yet. Then Officer Reyes stood up, nodded once, and left. Marcus stared at the cup of coffee for a long time before he picked it up. The diversion program was 6 months long, and it required more of Marcus than he had expected. Not in terms of time, though the hours were real. The weekly counseling sessions, the community service shifts, the life skills workshops that he had initially dismissed as patronizing and slowly, reluctantly began to find genuinely useful. What it required most was something harder than time. It required him to sit still. It required him to stop running from the silence inside himself, to stop filling every quiet moment with noise or chemicals or motion, and simply be present with who he was and what he had done and what he had let slip away. That was the hardest work Marcus had ever done in his life. There were sessions where he said almost nothing for an hour and left, feeling like he had run a marathon. There were nights in his transitional housing room where the walls felt like they were pressing inward, and every old instinct in his body screamed at him to leave, to run, to disappear into the city and become no one again. He didn't leave, he stayed. Night after night, he stayed. His counselor was a woman named Dr. Alicia Voss, who had a habit of asking questions and then waiting, without any visible discomfort, for as long as it took for the real answer to surface. She asked Marcus once what he would have been if everything had gone differently. He had laughed because the question felt absurd. She waited. He stopped laughing. After a long silence, he told her about the encyclopedias. He told her about the science fair. He told her that when he was 12 years old, he had wanted to understand how things worked. Not just machines or chemistry, but people, systems, the invisible architecture of the world. He told her he had a brain that never stopped asking questions, and that for the last decade he had been trying to drown it into silence because the questions had nowhere to go. Dr. Voss nodded and said that sounded like someone who was supposed to be a teacher. Marcus didn't respond, but he thought about it for the rest of the day, and the day after that, and the day after that. Near the end of the program, Marcus began volunteering at a GED prep center 2 evenings a week. He had signed up somewhat arbitrarily, needing volunteer hours and choosing the option that seemed least uncomfortable. What he had not anticipated was that the moment he sat down across from a boy, 22-year-old named Jerome, who was struggling with basic algebra, something would unlock in his chest that had been sealed for so long he had forgotten it was there. He didn't just help Jerome with the math. He stayed 2 hours past his shift, drawing diagrams on a whiteboard, finding ways to make the concepts land, watching the precise moment when understanding crossed. Jerome's face and feeling in that moment more like himself than he had in over a decade. He went home that night and sat on the edge of his bed and pressed his palms flat on his knees and breathed slowly, because he was afraid that if he moved too quickly the feeling would evaporate. It didn't evaporate. It was still there in the morning. He enrolled in a community college the following semester. He was 32 years old, and he was the oldest person in most of his classes, and he did not care even slightly. He studied education and sociology and human development, and he read everything he could find, and he asked questions in class with a hunger that sometimes made the younger students stare. He called his mother and told her what he was doing, and she was silent for so long that he thought the call had dropped. And then he heard her crying softly, and she said his name, just his name, nothing else, in a voice that carried 11 years of worry and love and relief, all braided together into 2 syllables. He had to excuse himself after the call and sit in the stairwell of his apartment, building for a while, just breathing. He thought often about the parking lot in the rain. He thought about what it meant that the worst night of his life had become the pivot point, the place where the long freefall finally found a floor. He had not asked to be caught. He had not been trying to be saved. He had simply run out of road, and in the running out, had been forced to stop. And in the stopping, had finally, for the first time in years, been still enough to hear what was left of himself. If you believe that every person carries something worth saving, if you believe in kindness and second chances, in the quiet courage it takes to start over when starting over feels impossible, then this story is yours too. Like this video and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the story is never over until it is over. Drop a comment below and tell us, have you ever had a moment when hitting rock bottom turned out to be the moment that saved you? Your words might be exactly what someone watching this right now needs to hear. Marcus Webb graduated with honors. He stood at the front of a classroom for the first time on a Tuesday, morning in October, chalk in his hand, a room full of young faces watching him, and he felt the full weight of everything it had taken to stand there. The arrests, the empty years, the granola bar in the puddle, the cup of coffee left by a stranger, the long nights of sitting still. He felt all of it, and it didn't feel like a wound anymore. It felt like the material out of which his life had been built. He turned to the board and began to write, and the chalk made a clean, sharp sound against the surface, and Marcus Webb, who had once been nothing but lost, began,